Hi everybody, Tony here. Before I begin this video though, I'm gonna enjoy this delicious cup of coffee. Here's an interesting fact. Sipping on this cup of coffee has made me a recreational drug user. And if you've ever done the same, you're a drug user too. Don't believe me? Well, coffee contains caffeine, which is a chemical that gives coffee its kick and makes you feel more alert. Caffeine is also a drug, and since I'm using caffeine, that makes me a drug user. The same thing applies to you, too. But I'm not alone, because caffeine is the most widely used psychoactive drug in the entire world, across all countries and national boundaries. It is used by 85% of Americans with an average daily consumption of 165 milligrams. Most of us receive it in our diets from coffee, carbonated soft drinks, and tea. It can also be found in energy drinks, energy shots, and even chocolate. But who can blame us drug users? Caffeine helps us wake up and be productive every day, and it tastes so darn good. The drink, I mean. I don't know what pure caffeine tastes like, of course. There are many more drugs out there than just caffeine, though, and that's what we're talking about today. Drugs in the United States. If that interests you, and I think it should, considering drugs play a part in most of our lives, then stick around. This is Long Story Short. If we're going to talk about drugs, we've got to define drugs first. Drugs are any chemical compound that has a specific, measurable, physiological response when introduced to the body. Drugs work at the biochemical level of biological organization to change the way certain processes inside your body behave. They are put into the body and they go to work, changing things to achieve whatever their intended function is. When most people think of drugs, they're thinking of one of two types: pharmaceutical drugs and recreational drugs. Pharmaceutical drugs are commonly referred to as medicine or medication. They're specifically designed to be used as part of a medical intervention in a patient. Many different types of pharmaceutical drugs exist, with a wide variety of chemical structures and a similar variety of effects on the human body. Recreational drugs aren't inherently different, but they're used for a different purpose: recreation. Enjoyment. These are usually psychotropic or psychoactive substances, traditionally known and feared throughout the United States as drugs. These are the drugs of particular importance to U.S. and international drug policies. There are many different types of psychotropic drugs. Hallucinogens, such as LSD, cause auditory and visual hallucinations in the consumer, as well as pupil dilation and loss of appetite. Stimulants, such as caffeine and cocaine, raise the arousal levels of individuals who ingest them, giving them increased confidence and energy, higher heart rate, and higher internal body temperature. Depressants, such as alcohol, depress the central nervous system, reducing the amount of work it does. These especially can lead to loss of consciousness and stop breathing, even death if taken in excess. The effects of these recreational psychotropic drugs aren't just limited to the mind, though. They also have effects on the body. Body chemistry is some complicated stuff. As a result, recreational drugs and pharmaceutical drugs are not mutually exclusive. They're both drugs. They both do drug things. It's just the context with which they are used, and in many cases, the dosage, which are different. Now we know a little bit about drugs in general and what types of drugs people often group together, at least as far as broad drug policy is concerned. Let's apply that knowledge to home, at least for us. How does the United States treat drugs? I'm not going to dive right into discussing the more recent war on drugs yet, just because it mostly concerns recreational drugs, and we haven't even talked about the two biggest examples yet: nicotine and alcohol. These drugs have persisted throughout the history of the nation and have often taken center stage in American culture. The longevity of these drugs makes them a useful reference for the effects drugs can have on society and how society responds to drugs. So, let's take a look at them. As many of us are well aware, the United States was initially formed as a British colony. Virginia was established in 1607 by royal charter as an incorporated colony for the purpose of making money. Originally, colonists looked for gold deposits to exploit. However, once the British found the nicotine-containing tobacco crop and realized its properties, it quickly took off as one of the main cash crops in the United States. King James I of England declared a royal monopoly on the tobacco products coming out of Virginia and collected a tax on all the tobacco exported. The profits from these farms went directly into the royal treasury. This means that the initial precursor to the United States of America was an administrative system designed to establish massive state-sponsored drug farms. Hey, I'll call it how I see it. King James I was basically a 17th century Pablo Escobar, sort of. Anyway, these drug farms fulfilled the economic mandate of mercantilism, a big focus for the English ambition in the Americas. Don't know what mercantilism is? Don't worry, we'll talk about it someday. But for right now, just know that it was an economic system designed to extract resources from overseas colonies and provide income to the mother nation. And that's exactly what the tobacco colonies in the Americas did for the English crown. Today, tobacco is still a major cash crop in Virginia, Maryland, Georgia, and all over the American South. In August 2017, 695 million pounds of tobacco were harvested. There are many reasons for why tobacco remains such a lucrative crop. One reason is that there's still a large market for it. 15.1% of all adults in the United States in 2015 smoked tobacco products. Its widespread cultivation is also what led to reduced prices for mass-produced tobacco. It's also worth noting that because it's so cheap and easy to get a hold of, a disproportionate number of the people who consume tobacco are low-income individuals. But let's acknowledge the elephant in the room here. With the overwhelming consensus of the international medical community regarding the harmful effects of consuming tobacco products, in case you hadn't heard, it's definitely something that causes cancer. Why was it never made illegal on health grounds? There are lots of reasons for this, but I believe it's primarily due to the intense pressure from the tobacco industry placed on state and federal legislative bodies. A ton of money is riding on the tobacco industry, and one of the only tobacco regulations that does exist involves a blanket purchasing ban on anyone under the age of 18. Otherwise, it's very easy to access tobacco. Realistically speaking, making a major money-producing crop like tobacco illegal would have a very negative effect on the entire southern economy. Additionally, tobacco taxes are a source of revenue for the U.S. government. This is an example of an excise tax, by the way, something the government can tack onto a product to inflate its price. In fact, an excise tax was the reason for the first insurrection against the federal government of the United States after the War of Independence. It wasn't a tax on tobacco, though. It was a tax on whiskey. Let's talk about alcohol now. In 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion was kicked off in Pennsylvania. The United States had levied a federal excise tax on alcoholic products. This was done in part to help the fledgling republic pay off its foreign debt. However, this tax on whiskey was wildly unpopular on the western frontier. This was because these farmers used whiskey distilled from their excess grain harvests as a de facto currency between each other for goods and services. They perceived this as a tax directly on their savings accounts, and this made them angry. Peaceful protests eventually evolved into violent reprisals against tax collectors and anyone who supported the tax. So, President Washington organized 13,000 militiamen and ordered them to suppress the uprising. They marched from Philadelphia into Appalachia, but not before the rebels disbanded. Thankfully, the Whiskey Rebellion was resolved in a peaceful manner before American lives were lost. The whiskey tax was later abolished by President Adams in 1802. This was due both to the massive unpopularity of the tax as well as the relatively negligible contribution the tax made to the national budget. The point, though, is that from the start, Americans have held alcohol in high regard. In this case, not only was it an intoxicating agent, but it also served as a real currency in local markets. They valued alcohol so much they were willing to take up arms against their government to protect it. Alcohol consumption, of course, remained a staple of American life throughout the 19th century. With the widespread consumption of alcohol came the widespread negative externalities caused by drinking alcohol. These include chronic drunkenness, missed work, and domestic abuse. In response, many individuals sought to prevent alcohol from being consumed. Thus, the temperance movement in the United States was born. Unlike earlier temperance movements, this one focused on passing anti-alcohol legislation rather than merely convincing individual citizens to stop drinking. This shift manifested in the organization of the Anti-Saloon League. This was a sophisticated lobbying machine, funded in part by the Rockefeller fortune, which influenced politicians to pursue dry alcohol policies. They cleverly introduced anti-drinking legislation, but not by nominating their own appointments for political office. Instead, they went to officials who were already elected and threatened to organize their powerful voting bloc against them during the re-election process unless they adopted an anti-alcohol stance. The push for temperance legislation advanced the cause more than voluntary abstinence from alcohol ever had before. It was the most effective method of enforcing abstinence from alcohol to ever be introduced to the nation. Then, when the First World War began, alcohol abolitionists attached prohibition to patriotism. Their rationale was that a sober society was a more productive society, and the war could be won more easily. With the extreme patriotic fervor produced by the war, this actually worked. The 18th Amendment was passed and essentially prohibited alcohol in the United States. This was the greatest success of the temperance movement. Of course, there's a reason alcohol isn't illegal today. There was widespread resistance to the 18th Amendment across the whole nation. The chief elements organizing this resistance were organized crime, bootleggers, and smugglers across the nation. While the supply was briefly eliminated, the demand for alcohol remained. And where money was involved, that demand would be met one way or another. Eventually, the 21st Amendment to the Constitution was passed, which was a total repeal of the 18th Amendment. This was after intense pressure to reinstate the status quo, as well as a perception of ineffective enforcement of the 18th Amendment. Just as Americans had proved during the Whiskey Rebellion, Americans wanted their drug, and they were willing to do whatever it took to get it. It was that important. Now that we've discussed America's leading recreational drugs, we've got the necessary perspective to get into the war on drugs. Because it doesn't seem to apply to all of them, which may seem strange based on what it's trying to accomplish. The war on drugs is the combined effort by the United States government to eradicate recreational psychotropic drug use. Seeing as recreational psychotropic drug use can apply to a lot of things, this goal has drastic implications regarding both domestic and foreign policy. Let's take a look at how 3 different presidential administrations have waged the war on drugs. How are the laws justified, and what are their effects? The war on drugs began during the Nixon administration. President Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs, ostensibly to combat the use of harmful psychotropic substances recreationally. In actuality, and I swear I'm not making this stuff up, the administration intensified its efforts to enforce anti-drug laws as a pretense to disrupt the anti-Vietnam War movement and African American organization against systemic racism. Don't believe me? Well, Nixon's domestic policy advisor, John Ehrlichman, admitted to the ulterior motives of the war on drugs with Harper's Magazine. Nixon knew that he couldn't criminalize being black or being opposed to the war in Vietnam. By linking anti-war sentiments to marijuana usage and being black to heroin usage, he could still oppress those vocal minorities. Essentially, the war on drugs, as we know it, was originally formulated by the Nixon administration as an attempt to suppress political dissidents in the United States. By arresting them and convicting them of felonies, they were disenfranchised from voting, preventing them from causing any more meaningful trouble at the voting booth. The effects this had on the cultural consciousness of the United States regarding these two groups were profound. To this day, hippies are associated with cannabis usage, or maybe it's the other way around, and heroin? It was often considered a black drug, and its users were often ostracized from society, despite the far-reaching reality of the current opioid epidemic and drug abuse in general. Nixon also established the Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA. The DEA got its start in 1973 as an agency under the Department of Justice to combine the national efforts to fight the war on drugs. The DEA has the authority to enforce all drug policies of the United States. In order to better enforce these laws, they have organized all the different illegal drugs into different groups, or schedules. Schedule I drugs include those chemical compounds deemed most dangerous to society with no applicable medical benefits. Schedule I drugs include heroin, LSD, and, controversially, MDMA and marijuana. Schedules II through V are substances with a listed lower potential for abuse and greater medical potential. For some perspective, though, cocaine is a Schedule II drug, and oddly enough, alcohol isn't scheduled at all. We'll come back to that. In order for an individual or group to access any scheduled substance, they require explicit permission from the DEA. They must also keep accurate information on the quantity of the substance procured. Scheduled substances cannot be legally accessed or researched without this explicit permission from the DEA. That means that every scheduled substance is illegal without the proper clearance. This gives the DEA the job of finding those who ignore these drug rules and punishing them. During the Reagan administration, a number of programs were implemented to further assist the United States in winning this war on drugs. Chief among them was the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program, or DARE, established by both the LAPD and the Los Angeles Unified School District. It was designed to educate children about the harmful effects of illegal psychotropic substances. This involved explaining the effects of drugs and counseling them and strategies to resist pressure to experiment with drugs. Unfortunately, much of this education and counseling was inaccurate or low quality. The overwhelming majority of scientific studies regarding the efficacy of DARE programs, both in the United States and in England, have shown that it has either no effect or even an adverse effect on drug use. In other words, these programs had exactly the opposite effect as intended. In many cases, they were a step backwards. Nancy Reagan, the First Lady of the United States, also started an anti-drug movement with her Just Say No campaign. When asked by a child what should be done should she be offered drugs, Mrs. Reagan famously told her, "Just say no." Of course, like with many other questionable decisions in life, saying no is often less straightforward than it may seem. Substance abuse and use is much more complex than simply agreeing to use drugs or promising not to do drugs. A scientific consensus on why drug users and abusers behave the way they do doesn't entirely exist, but in a general sense, drug use often serves to numb the pain of experiencing a difficult reality. Doing drugs suspends normal consciousness, which distracts people from the problems presenting in their lives. Telling somebody to simply refuse drugs does little to alleviate whatever drove them to consider drugs in the first place. In more recent times, the war on drugs has kind of changed drastically, and kind of not. During the Obama administration, opioid addiction was cleverly reframed as a public health crisis and not a crime wave as it had been previously viewed. All of a sudden, the term opioid epidemic entered the public lexicon. No longer are heroin addicts filthy criminals who need to be locked up. Now, they're patients suffering from the disease of addiction who require medical intervention. This makes sense, especially understanding that addiction is a tough situation to escape from. While it's still too early to judge the efficacy of this strategy of compassion rather than criminalization, and while it can hardly be said that the whole of U.S. drug policy is moving in this direction, because right now it doesn't seem like it, we should all pay close attention to it. The other major contemporary drug development is the push to legalize marijuana for medical and recreational purposes. Supporters of marijuana legalization state that the negative effects of the drug are completely overblown. They also state that it has several medical uses, including appetite modulation in chemotherapy patients, and seizure prevention in certain cases of epilepsy. Since marijuana is a Schedule I substance, and Schedule I substances by definition have no currently acceptable medical use, pro-legalization activists believe it should be descheduled. The medical community has largely backed them up on this one, and state law is starting to as well. So far, 8 states have decriminalized cannabis for both medical and recreational use, and many more states have medical marijuana programs on the books. All of this is, of course, in direct violation of the federal policy on cannabis, because, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary, cannabis is still classified by our government as a very dangerous drug. Believe it or not, that was a quick summary. But that brings us to today. Our country was built on recreational drugs. We've outlawed at least one of them before changing our minds, and then we outlawed most of them again, for dubious reasons and not very effectively. Oh, and none of this applies to America's favorite drugs like alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine. So, what's my point here? Well, there's a common theme with the war on drugs, and it isn't a good one. It's failure and arbitrary laws. Looking solely at drug policy, because that's what we're discussing, the Nixon administration failed America by establishing an organization with the underhanded goal of disenfranchising its citizens. And that's putting it lightly. Regarding drugs, Reagan's administration failed America when it endorsed an ineffective and dangerous program which couldn't complete its goal of educating people about drugs in a safe manner. If only because much of that education was either shallow or inaccurate, or both. In fact, I believe the greatest progress towards a more rational drug policy, and really this isn't that big of a step for 50+ years, came only under the Obama administration, which introduced some sense of compassion and tolerance to the system. But is anyone surprised? It seems these days, for most people, that failure is the only expected outcome from the war on drugs. If it was going to succeed at its goal of keeping Americans safe and healthy, if that was really what this all was about, it would have also gone to war against alcohol and tobacco, 2 dangerously addictive drugs with essentially zero benefits and very well-documented dangers. And really, regardless of your political stance on these things, I think that's the most clear problem with the way we view drugs in this country. In this video, I've told you a lot about history, definitions, what drugs are and how they were used in America, a simple timeline of the war on drugs, but it all feels sloppy because I can't explain the most important part. I haven't been able to give you a solid reason for why some drugs are okay and some drugs aren't. Yes, there's the scheduling system, but its inclusion of drugs like marijuana and exclusion of drugs like alcohol suggests that its rules aren't based on reality. It all makes the way our government deals with drugs feel kind of arbitrary. In fact, it makes it feel totally arbitrary. These drugs are fine because, well, everyone does them. This is a free country. Why take that away? But these drugs, they're bad because only bad people use them. Don't point out how much harm they actually cause in comparison to each other because we don't want to talk about that. Why do you care anyway? You're not a criminal, right? That's the message I'm getting, that the laws are arbitrary. And I don't like it when the government threatens people with harm for arbitrary reasons. Frankly, I don't think anybody should like that. It makes me uncomfortable. So what do you think? Is the war on drugs a good thing or a bad thing? Should we keep the scheduling system? Is any of this mess salvageable? Let me know what you think about this in the comments. I'm Tony Pearson. This has been Long Story Short. Thank you all for watching as usual. This was a really pointed video. I know that we weren't really pulling any punches when it came to the war on drugs in particular when we got to that point. Generally speaking, I don't like presenting arguments that are as one-sided as this one was, but this is one of the few scenarios where I do feel it's kind of justified, in that when it comes to the war on drugs, you really need to go out of your way to find anything really positive
I mean, honest to God, in researching this thing, it seems from the very beginning, it was kind of a joke. I mean, not actually a joke because people went and are still going to jail over this stuff. But you know what I mean. That being said, I'm sure that it has had at least some positive outcomes for someone somewhere. So if any of you are those people, please let us know in the comments. Additionally, we are just a YouTube channel, so don't take our word for all this. If this piqued your curiosity on the subject, there is a lot of literature out there on the war on drugs, how effective it's been, the effects it's had on the country and the world. I mean, this video is barely scratching the surface, so I can't recommend doing outside research enough. Anyway, this video is really long as is, so I'm gonna sign off. Talk to y'all next week.